Hello, and welcome to your first lesson, the Introduction to the Language of Astrology, Archetypes. Today we're going to start with looking at the natural zodiac and the Aries archetype. I'm going to take you through a little story and give you some information to digest about this particular archetype. Then I'd like you to take some time to really try to integrate it into your somatic body. I'm going to give you a couple chart examples to help you identify and pick out the necessary elements and give you an opportunity to put them into sentence form to get you familiar with the language around speaking about these archetypes. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework as a way to actively infer, active inference is what it's called, in order to help you develop and integrate it into your somatic system. So let's get started. I want to talk about the natural zodiac because it is very important in evolutionary astrology. We look at the natural zodiac as a life cycle. If you can put it into this frame, it helps to understand how these archetypes interplay, how they work together, and how they have conversations with each other, and how it is observable. Everything that is evolutionary astrology, or EA, is based on natural law, which is something that is observable and it can be correlated with experience. We are learning about putting it into our felt sense so that we can integrate what it feels like to experience each of these archetypes. Once we have that, and once we have gone through all 12, we will begin to layer, and that's when the beauty of it comes out, and that's when the depth of EA is very apparent. So starting with the natural zodiac, if we think about it, like I said, as a life cycle, we're beginning at the sign of Aries all the way around to the sign of Pisces. And as we know that life is cyclical, life is always a moving spiral. The universe moves in a spiral. And so just as we come to the ending of something, Pisces, we begin anew, Aries. So if we think about the life cycle, we're born, we're babies, and we grow, and we develop our sense of autonomy, we develop our sense of ego. We learn what we like, what we don't like, and how we can be discerning and connected to other people, how we create attachments to others, how we explore the world and develop our sense of perspective, how we see our own self in an arc of direction, how we work to break old patterns and really truly become our authentic selves, and how we connect to the divine within. So I'm going to take you through the Aries archetype first, and we will see then by the time we get to Pisces how each of these things come together. So Aries, it is a cardinal modality. It is a fire element. It's ruled by the planet Mars, and it's associated with the first house. Aries is a yang or masculine energy, meaning that it's moving outward from the center. If you are the center of your being, Aries is a moving out energy. So cardinal, as we mentioned in the introduction, is always associated with change. We think about the cardinal points as the seasons, changing of the seasons. The beginning of Aries season is the beginning of spring in the northern hemisphere. A fire element always contains certain characteristics. It contains this idea of a sense of destiny and a sense of passion, a sense of purpose, and is active. One thing specifically about evolutionary astrology is that it always looks at these archetypes as a trinity. So when I talk about the Aries archetype, I'm also talking about Mars, and I'm also talking about the energy that is contained within the first house of any zodiac wheel, any chart that you're looking at. Whenever you see Mars, whenever you see Aries, whenever you see the first house, it all contains the same energetic signature. This will become more apparent when we begin to layer and synthesize in our interpretations. But know that it's important whenever we look at any archetype, it always contains or is contained within the planet, the sign, and the house, all the same archetypal energy. So when we're talking about Aries, and we're talking about this idea of it being a yang expression, an outward expression, and it being a cardinal fire, so it's initiating change, and it contains this passion and drive and desire. It's something that is very present. We all carry Aries energy. Some just express it more than others, or it's more apparent in other people's lives. But we all have this desire to do new things, to move, and it creates this initiative within us. So as I mentioned, everything in evolutionary astrology is based on natural law, something that is observable and can be correlated. So one thing I want to discuss is if we're taking it through a life cycle and we're looking at things in the natural world, a seed would be Aries, the seed that contains all the necessary DNA to simply exist. It has everything that it's going to need to be able to express its traits over time. For example, a tree nut or a seed that's planted, it has everything in it already to become the great tree. Even though you may not see it, even though we may not understand it at first, know that everything that is needed to be your authentic self is already contained within the seed that is you. So when we think about it from the human perspective, the natural world of human experience, Aries is about new birth, birthing something new. It's also about arrival, coming into being and existence, simply in that state of being. So the thing that we can look at, the mantra for Aries and Mars in the first house, it is this energy of I am here, I exist, I am the beginning, or I am beginning something. So in the beginning, there was, and this is what we're working on. Anytime we want to begin something new, we're using our Aries energy. Think about when you started this course. Something interested you. You had this desire, and you chose to act. That is using your Aries energy. So when we talk about the archetypes, we must also understand that they do not exist within a vacuum. They exist in the natural zodiac, and they have these conversations with other signs, with other energies. So when we talk about the term aspect, it's the same as saying the type of conversation that it's having with the other archetypes. So when I talk about polarity, we're talking about the opposite sign from whatever we're looking at. In this instance, the opposite or polarity to Aries is Libra. And I'm going to get into this a little further in the next slide. But understanding that every sign also contains within it the polarity. Yes, it's having conversations with these other signs and these other energies, but the polarity itself speaks to the idea that it doesn't exist alone. The polarity is contained within each other. But today we're going to look at the opposition, which is directly across. That's 180 degree from the point that we're looking at. So 180 degrees from Aries is Libra. We're going to be looking at sextiles. A sextile is a 60-degree angle, and the sextile to Aries is Aquarius and Gemini. And then we're also going to look at the squares. And this is the natural zodiac again, something that is we see in nature, we see in the human experience. So the natural squares to Aries are Capricorn and Cancer. So let's dig in. Let's talk about the opposition first. So as I mentioned, 180-degree opposition from Aries is Libra. It's also what is called the polarity. Whenever we have a sign in opposition, it is the polarity. So understanding the Libra archetype, which we will get to, is to help us understand how Aries functions. Libra is contained within Aries, and Aries is contained within Libra. When we are using our Aries energy to begin something new, we have this instinctual drive to do something. We're here, we're showing up, we want to go, we want to do, but sometimes we may not know what that is, or we may not know how to begin. And so we draw in, by using our Aries energy, we draw in the Libra energy, which in this case is counsel. So think about a time when you wanted to begin something new. You wanted to start a class, and you weren't sure how to go about doing that. So you asked questions. You sought out counsel from someone who knows more than you, someone who has more experience in that particular area than you. That is the Libra counsel. So the sextiles to Aries, as I mentioned, are Gemini and Aquarius. Sextiles are a supportive aspect. They kind of give us this nudge. It's a gentler push in a way to embrace and experience the energy. So what does Gemini have to say to Aries? It says, be curious. It doesn't mean that Aries comes first and then Gemini. It does in the natural zodiac. But what I want you to understand is that they actually are working at the same time. Sometimes you begin by being curious, and then you act. Sometimes you act on something and then become more curious. You ask the questions. So when you are starting a new job, for example, you need to learn how things work. And you've sought out the counsel that becomes your mentor or your trainer. And you ask questions. You naturally become curious about what it is that I'm supposed to be doing. Aquarius says to to Aries, Aquarius says to Aries, you have these patterns within you that if you're going to do something new, you may have to break out of those old patterns. So for example, you start this new job and you've worked in that industry before, but this company does things a little differently. And so you're being curious, you're learning something new. You also may have to recognize that you've had prior training that now needs to be reflected upon and potentially changed. So breaking down the old patterns and doing something new. This is the Aquarius-Aries connection. So let's talk about the natural squares. We have the square to Cancer, and then we have the square to Capricorn. Squares are a dynamic tension that exists within our psyche. I like to think of it as a place where we need to turn a corner. It's a choice point. There's something around the corner that we need or that we want, and we must go around the corner to be able to see what that is or to reach it. So the natural square between Aries and Cancer, if we think about it this way, Aries shows up. It says, here I am, I want to do, I want to go, and I'm ready. And Cancer says, whoa, wait a minute. Is it safe? Is it something that's going to provide us with some sense of security? And so there's this idea or this feeling of insecurity that can come between this square. So for an example, when I see someone who has Mars, the planet of the archetype we're talking about, in the sign of Cancer, it helps me to understand the layering and the synthesis of those two energies. Because of this natural square, you can probably deduce that someone who has this placement experiences a lot of insecurity whenever they want to try to do something new, whenever they have a desire to try something or do something new, they may feel a little bit held back because of this separation anxiety. I'm separating from the familiar. And we all experience this anytime we want to do something new that is unfamiliar to us. We have this sense of I'm leaving the familiar and moving into the unfamiliar. And it creates this natural insecurity. So when we talk about the square to Capricorn, we're talking about our own framework of reality, Capricorn, and how it is that we want to do something new, Aries. I have this desire, I have this drive. I'm curious. Gemini has told me to be curious. Aquarius has told me it's time to break free from those old patterns. And I'm a little bit insecure because I'm leaving the familiar. So Capricorn says there's these expectations that exist. Expectations that come from external sources, such as culture or society, or your conditioning, or you may have internal expectations. And so recognizing that this dynamic tension exists between what your reality is currently, what you expect of yourself, and what you know of the expectations of others, compared to what it is that you really want to do. So I want to launch this new business, but I don't know if I'm going to succeed. And so I sort of have this expectation that, I'm going to fail. Or there's expectations of me from my family that I'm going to always have a good job, a stable job. And so to try to do something new, like launching my own business, it creates the tension between those expectations and what it is that I want to do. So that is the square to Capricorn. So as much as I want to create this idea of embodying the archetypes and feeling them through our somatic senses, we still have to understand that there are keywords that come with each energy, each archetype. And I don't want to particularly label all of the things when we get to our layering and our interpretation, but these are important words that contain ideas about the Aries archetype. So I already mentioned separation anxiety. I've mentioned desires, but it's also about identity. Who am I? I just know that I'm here and I exist. And I need freedom to explore. I need this sense of independence. I don't want to be restricted. It is our natural instinct. It is the instinctual drive that we have to follow our desires. Mars is also associated with anger or rage, because it is a masculine fire energy that's part of how we feel sometimes. And when we are acting on our anger, we are using that Aries energy. One word that I didn't put on here that I want to bring up is courage and bravery. Because just as much as we can use our Aries energy to act in anger, it's also what we need to have courage to create something new. It's this sense of initiative, an expression of our will. And it's also about self-interest. If we think about a baby, when they are first born, they don't know how to feed themselves. They don't know how to change their own diapers. They don't know how to soothe themselves yet. And so they become very self-interested. They're very self-focused. And so part of the Aries energy is this idea of self-interest. It can become complex, of course, and become something like narcissism. But I want you to understand that it's important to have a sense of self-interest. You need this sense of self-interest. It is important because you are the one taking care of you. And so finding what makes you tick, finding what makes you you, finding what your needs are is very important to you becoming your authentic self. So let's take a look at some chart practices. Here I would like you to just identify the symbols. Where is the first house? Where is the sign of Aries? Where is the planet Mars? Pause the video, and when you come back, I'll show you. So here we have Mars in the sign of Aries. Wow, that's a double signature, right? Because it's the same energy. We have the first house, and we see the line that's called the cusp at the beginning of the first house, between the numbers 12 and 1. If we follow that line to the outer circle, that shows us what sign is on that house cusp. And here it is the sign of Aries. Whew, so again, another double signature, because first house and Aries are the same energy. So this is someone who carries a lot of Aries energy. This is someone who I would expect to be very open, very outward, very expressive, and who acts on the things that they want in life. We'll have to find out about that when we look into interpretation more. But if you just think about this energy and the fact that it's very prominent here, we can see that that's probably something that is involved in this person's life. Let's look at the second one. Same thing. Identify where Aries is in the chart, identify Mars, and identify the first house, where it is and where is this, what sign is on the house cusp. Again, pause the video, take a look, and when you come back, I'll show you. So here we have Aries. If we look at the sign of Aries, and then we see the line that is within that red area, follow that line back to the inner circle, and the house that is just to the right of it, meaning the number. So this here is the line between houses 5 and 6. So that line is the beginning of house 6, and Aries is on that cusp. So we would say that Aries rules the 6th house in this chart. Mars, we find Mars in the sign of Gemini in the 8th house. We see on the first house, we see the number 1. We see the line between number 12 and number 1. That is the beginning of the first house, or the first house cusp, also known as your rising sign or your ascendant. When we take the line and go over to the outer circle, we see that the sign of Scorpio is on that house cusp. So we would say to this person that you have a Scorpio rising or a Scorpio ascendant. All right, let's look at the next one. Same thing. We're identifying Mars, Aries, and the first house. What house does Aries rule? Where is Mars by house and sign? And what sign is on the first house cusp? Now this one's a little tricky. When you pause the video, you may need to enlarge your screen so that you can see exactly where the house cusps begin. Let's start with Mars because it's easy to find and easy to see. Mars is in the sign of Sagittarius in the 3rd house. Let's look at the rising sign. Do you remember what the rising sign is? Also called the ascendant. It's the beginning of the first house. So we'll identify house number 1. We look at the line at the beginning of house number 1, which is between 12 and 1. We take that line, follow it to the outer circle to see where it intersects. What sign is ruling the first house? And the reason I said this is a little trickier is because it's at 0 degrees, meaning it's at the very beginning of a sign. So here we have Libra on the first house cusp. So we would say that this person has a Libra rising or a Libra ascendant. Now let's find Aries. Aries is on the 7th house cusp. How we find this is we find the sign of Aries, we find the line that is connected to it, and we move to the inner circle to see what number is connected to just right of that line. So here it is the 7th house. Great job. Let's move on to some deeper practice. I've been giving you these sentences as I have showed you where each of those placements are. Here I want you to label them and then identify and practice the sentences. So it's the same thing that we've been doing, but now I want you to practice the sentence. So in this chart we have Aries ruling the 9th house. And if you notice, there's actually 2 lines within that sign, the 9th house line and the 10th house line. And this is something a little bit more advanced, and we'll get into that in later lessons. But this is an important signature because Aries rules 2 houses, not just 1. Let's find Mars. Mars is in the sign of Gemini in the 11th house. So can you practice that sentence? And then we have the first house. First house cusp is Leo. So first house is ruled by Leo. This person has a Leo ascendant or a Leo rising. And I want to point out that just because there are no planets in a particular sign does not mean that that energy is not expressed. Because again, this is natural law. We all have all 12 archetypes and we all express them. We just express them in different patterns. And so here, because there's nothing in the first house or Leo, it doesn't mean that that person does not experience the combination of those 2 archetypes. And we'll get into that when we do our interpretations. So now we come to the idea of active inference. This is what I mentioned at the beginning, which is connecting to that felt sense. And so how you connect to your Aries energy is, as I mentioned, think about sometime when you wanted to begin something new and how you felt approaching the start line. Were you a little insecure, or were you really curious? Did you think about expectations, or how am I supposed to go about doing this? Do I have to do it this way, or do I have to do it this way? And did you maybe think about old patterns that you had that you needed to reframe or think about in a new way? And then when you actually began, how did you feel? Were a lot of those sensations still present, but you used your Aries courage to continue, and that drive and that will to keep going? So just over the next week until we have our next class, spend some time in active inference. Spend some time noticing of how you use your Aries energy and see it in the world. Watch other people or talk to other people about their experiences when they are doing something new. How did they feel before? And how did they feel once they started? In order to be successful, we always must take the first step. And you have done so. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time for the Taurus archetype.